To start now, my name is Brian Lance with the LaRouche Political Action Committee here in Houston, Texas. This is Saturday, of course. It's a little bit after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In the last 24 hours, we've had a shocking set of developments in Paris, France, which all of you, I believe, are aware of. Well over 100 people are dead now, and dozens more are in hospitals in critical condition. This afternoon, Mr. LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, being briefed on the particulars as we have them so far, and that's a very limited basis that we have of reports and data, actually hard data coming in, hard reports coming in. Stressed that this was a large operation, extensive operation far beyond France, and we had to start in terms of an investigation from the standpoint of the British Empire, the backers of the Barack Obama presidency, including, of course, the City of London and Wall Street financial nexus. The context is very important here. At this very moment, there's a series of international conferences occurring or about to occur. And in each of those cases, of these major conferences, which each has multiple implications in terms of the outcomes, potential outcomes, the British are losing control. The financial oligarchy is losing control of the processes. So if we look at today, APEC, conference is occurring beginning today in Manila, and Barack Obama is there or soon will be there. In the Philippines, the Senate of the Philippines, the Congress, the Senate body of the Congress, has voted that the executive agreement reached between the president of the Philippines and the Obama administration to allow once again the placing of U.S. military personnel, aircraft, ships, battleships, and so forth in the Philippines is unconstitutional and is subject to approval by the Senate of the Philippines, and it's unlikely that it will pass. So a confrontation is occurring in the Philippines, a confrontation that really is something blowing up in the face of Barack Obama and his so-called Asian pivot against China. Now, at the same time, we have going on in Vienna, Austria, we have the conference, international conference, really, on Syria, which of course has been instigated over the last several weeks by Secretary of State Kerry and the Russian Secretary of State equivalent, Foreign Minister Lavrov, but now encompasses Egypt, China, France, Germany, the Emirates, and so on and so forth, as well as, of course, the United States and Russia. And the momentum here and the work being done, particularly by Russia, to find a diplomatic solution that will result in the crushing of ISIS and the restoration of sovereignty to Syria, to Syria's government institutions, and to other countries in the region. That's moving forward, and that is not the United States' interest. That's not Barack Obama's chosen pathway. Then, thirdly, I'll mention the climate conference coming up in Paris, COP21, which begins at the beginning of December. Registration starts at the end of this month. So really just 2 weeks away. And of course, Paris is where this horrendous, tragic event has occurred in the last 24 hours, these terrorist assaults. the origin of which is not known yet. We know that ISIS has claimed responsibility, ISIL, but that's still something to be determined with finality, and is obviously part of a larger process. But in terms of the COP21 conference, the climate change conference, so-called, coming up at the end of this month, you have a determined opposition of countries such as India, China, the group of 120 countries formerly known as the group of 77, so-called developing countries, to the agenda that's been being opposed by the Atlantic sector. The attempt to impose limits on economic growth, industrial growth, energy consumption, and so on and so forth, all under the false science of so-called CO2 emissions and some hypothetical connection or a causal relationship, I should say more specifically, between CO2 emissions and global warming. And it's being rejected. The representative from South Africa already to the COP21 conference has already rejected the proposed statement that would be released from the conference as an agreement, has already rejected it as technological apartheid. This is the government of South Africa speaking. Modi of India has stressed that the alleviation of poverty is the #1 priority for his nation, for his government and his nation, and so on and so forth. So the attempt to impose continue to impose a neo-colonial policy of limited development, of poverty, of disease, of famine, and so forth on the world's population. The desire of the British royal family, as Prince Philip has emphasized, to reduce the world population to 1 billion people from its currently almost 8 billion people, is being rejected, as is the phony war on terrorism that the Obama administration has been carrying out in the Middle East. So in all of these, in these three major venues, the APEC summit in Manila, the Vienna negotiations over Syria, which is turning into a broader discussion and deliberation process on a coalition against international terrorism, and then on the COP21 conference coming up at the end of the month. In all these venues, Obama, but more importantly, the broader financial British empire, as we can refer to it, is losing control. And the BRICS process, BRICS nations, and the commitments and collaboration for economic development are moving forward. This is the backdrop for what has occurred in Paris over the last 24 hours. So we will continue to investigate. We will be reporting it on the LaRouche PAC website and in our publications. Those of you that are now getting the EIR Daily Alert by email will get this as rapidly as possible on updates on a daily basis. Otherwise, it'll be available, as I said, on our websites and is available through our offices. So that's a brief summary update. And what I'd like to do at this point is to move into the presentation which we had planned for today otherwise, which is not, is relevant, profoundly relevant, is the question of a revived US space program and a collaboration of the United States with other nations to move man to the galactic level. The development of a galactic science program driver as the new approach which mankind sorely requires at this point for his own durable survival. And that's critical. We're not talking about day-to-day survival here. We're talking about durable survival for peoples, for nations, and so that's what we'll be taking up here in this last in this the remainder of this show today. Now, I want to emphasize in terms of this concept of a galactic science driver. We're dealing with concepts that are relativistic, and so it's important to, I think, to just put that out right away. If one of the features of a galactic science driver is the need to understand the processes that threaten us in terms of asteroids and comets. Asteroids, of course, are generally thought to be within the solar system, or at least the the Kepler belt. But when you're coming to comets, you're talking about those coming in from what's now termed the Oort cloud, which is 50 to 100,000 astronomical units out from here, and which we're not going to get a lot of advance notice because those comets are coming in at extraordinary speeds, 70 kilometers a second, for example, which you're talking about 50, 70, 100,000 miles an hour, or equivalent coming in. I was just asked, what's an astronomical unit? That's the approximate distance between the Earth and the Sun. Of course, the Earth's orbit changes. It's a kind of average unit. It goes back to the time of at least Kepler in terms of approximations. But so astronomical units, that again gets at the very relativistic notions. We're talking about the Oort cloud being, say, up to 100,000 astronomical units out from the solar system. These are figures that boggle the mind in terms of day-to-day calculations. Back to the main thread. If we're speaking in terms of galactic principles and so forth, we have to think in terms of time also in a relativistic fashion. Our notions of time, take asteroids, or comets for that matter. One could say, and I'm sure you've thought it yourself if this subject has come up, well, asteroids. I mean, how often do asteroids hit? I've never seen it. My parents never saw an asteroid hit. There was one over Kamchatka in Russia a couple years back, which exploded in the atmosphere. That's as close as we really come, at least in our own lifetimes, to an asteroid hit. However, in the context of geophysical time and astronomical time, it's like speaking of the Oort cloud. The universe doesn't operate on our time. Or if you will, you can say God doesn't operate with our concept of time. Right?
There was one big asteroid that hit out there, like in the eastern part of Russia, like around 1907.
Right, right. I was just told there was one in 1907. Anyway, that's at least not in my lifetime, I guess. So while we haven't experienced an asteroid hit here, we know they've counted up now at least 180 asteroid hits that have hit planet Earth, and that's there's probably many more. We don't know it because we have an atmosphere, we have oceans, which are constantly reshaping the surface of the Earth, just like we just found out that Pluto's surface has been, paved over, if you will, with new layers of ice over whole sections of Pluto in the course of the last 10 million years. Of course, we don't know really when, but there's ongoing changes of the planet, and in those sections of Pluto, it's a relatively smooth surface. But on the other parts, which have not seen this kind of activity on the surface, you have a pockmarked surface like the moon in areas. So just by comparison, think of the moon, think of Pluto, think of the moon, and think of us really probably not looking a lot different than the moon if you took away the oceans and atmosphere and so forth that have had their effects. So we now have within reach a capability which didn't exist 100 years ago. We couldn't have even considered stopping asteroids 100 years ago. But we have that capability now. And since we do have to think in terms of, if you will, God's time, or time in the sense of universal time, or time, different time frames, relativistically time frames, we better get on it, because we do know more comet and asteroid hits are coming. A second area, I'm just trying to identify the practicality of thinking about things galactical. We're not talking about the spaceship Galactica or you know, science fiction. We're talking about the actual galaxy that we're in. We know now that we're in a solar system. NASA has reached out. We've been near to all of the planets in the solar system that we identify as part of our solar system. We know a certain amount. We're still learning a lot about the sun's interaction with the Earth. We have a lot more to learn there. But beyond the solar system, we know that there's a galaxy. And we know that our solar system is moving through this galaxy. It's not static. It's not even moving in synchronicity with the galaxy. It's moving through the galaxy under changing circumstances. And they show this last Thursday, I believe. Was it Thursday or Wednesday? Wednesday, the last show. You have a series of shows now on the LaRouche website being done by Ben Denniston and his team, the science team, which are taking people through over the course of maybe 6, 7, 8 1-hour shows, various aspects of what we know and what we don't know, the anomalies and so forth of emerging galactic science, for lack of a better word. And so I really recommend those shows, and this one last week was discussing some of exactly this in more detail than we can cover here today. Another feature of the galaxy which has come to the fore, and which we've been discussing and presenting on our website and presenting in meetings like this, is the role of the galaxy in shaping weather, our weather, right here on Earth. And this involves the principle of atmospheric ionization and the ionization of molecular structures, atomic structures in the atmosphere, ionization of that atmospheric, those atmospheric particles, if you will, by, in fact, as it turns out, incoming cosmic rays, photons primarily, also other rays, gamma rays, photons, X-rays, photons and other rays coming in and ionizing particles and creating the conditions for cloud formation. And the vagaries of that, both in our relationship and the solar system's relationship to the galaxy, but also by the interaction between the Earth and the Sun and the galaxy, and the way that these shield or don't shield at various times this flow of cosmic rays, and the effects of this on the climate is something that's a very fruitful area of study. Not only that, but the best estimates are, just to summarize, that we are moving into a period in terms of the Earth's and the solar system's location inside the solar system, where there is going to be less cloud formation, and that we're already seeing that. Witness the drought that we think of in a most singular way in terms of California, but stretching all the way into West Texas. So that we're dealing with long-term processes of change, and they require changes in our activity, not just on the level of individual activity. I mean, we're not going to be able to deal with a galactically caused drought on Earth by rationing, you know, and similar measures. We're going to have to engage in geoengineering. We're going to have to develop methods beyond that of actually taking control of this process of atmospheric ionization for ourselves. And it would otherwise be a good thing because actually we need the perfect nature. This is really an underpinning of the whole idea of a galactic principle as we're presenting it, as LaRouche and science team have presented it, is man as a positive force, as opposed to the COP21 climate change agenda that man is a bane, is a parasite on Mother Earth and needs to be removed or reduced rapidly. Quite the opposite. We have a role to play in perfecting, first of all, our own climate. Obviously, the deserts are a mistake. We need to actually transform these large desert areas like the Sahel and so forth for mankind and for nature, for the biosphere, to increase its energy flux density, its productivity, and so on and so forth, its carrying capacity, if you will. And beyond that, our role in the solar system and the galaxy as a whole. So this question of atmospheric ionization, cosmic radiation coming from nebulae, coming from stellar explosions, and so forth, and other sources. We don't know all the sources where cosmic rays are coming from. That's still, an open field. That's part of what we have to come to understand and comprehend. Okay, so we can come back to there may be questions, comments, and so forth to fill that out a bit. But from the standpoint of the galactic approach of what mankind is facing as a whole, we've got to have a cooperative approach. Asteroid defense. We're not going to defend a pea patch with asteroid defense. Consider in a very practical way that we determine that there's an asteroid coming in. It's maybe 20 kilometers across. It's coming in at 40,000 miles an hour, equivalent. But we've identified it 10 years out. Well, we can determine pretty much where that asteroid's going to hit. Now, an asteroid of that size is not going to wipe out the human race. It may wipe out a whole country. Now, who defends against that asteroid?
That country.
Yes, well, there you go. There's somebody that's stirring things up. If we say, oh, well, that country that's going to get hit, hey, it's up to you. It's, hey, this is a game changer for you, isn't it? Right?
You don't even have a space program.
Right. You've got less than 10 years to kinetically intersect this thing and knock it off course, or send up an H-bomb and blow it off course, or anyway, there's a number of different possible gravity tractor. There's a number. You can look these up. There's different ideas of what could be done, but you have a very short window in which you have to get something up there, but you also have to get it up there with 100% guarantee that it's going to do the job. You can't just kind of half-ass it, right? You've got to know this is going to do the job, because you're not going to have another chance. So and if it's a poor part of the world, can you imagine the debate? The United Nations is going to have a debate about who's going to pay for this or who's not. And they'll say, well, we're going to create a fund, like they supposedly created a fund for the refugees coming out of North Africa and the Middle East. This is not a joke. I mean, funds have been created by the European Union and so forth, but there's no money in the fund, right? Refugees are starving in the refugee camps because there's no food. So are we going to leave it to these super national institutions that are going to somehow make decisions? You can believe that that's not going to work under current conditions. So this is a very, so this is an example of where a pea patch approach isn't going to work. We're either going to hang together, to cite the old adage from the American Revolution, or we're going to hang separately. So So a global defense system against asteroids is the only system that's actually going to work. I mean, just to give you another example, say we had an asteroid coming in, we knew it was coming in, and we knew it was going to hit Russia. And we said to the Russians, hey, this is your problem. Now, what do you think, you know, a thermonuclearly armed Russia is going to do to us? I mean, they'll take their actions against the asteroid if they're capable. They're not right now, but they, you know, you can just imagine how this thing can play out geopolitically. Okay, so I think that's just useful to kind of frame this and make clear that this is a sensuous matter that we're dealing with here. Now, we have a problem in this country in dealing with these kinds of issues. And the question of water ionization and so on, there's a, you know, we could discuss that as well. But we have a problem in this country in particular because we're privatizing the space program. This has been underway over the course of the Bush, Cheney, and Carter administrations in particular. You can trace its steps further back, but in particular, over the course of the Bush and Obama administrations, we have increasingly privatized the U.S. space program, centered around, of course, NASA, with the Department of Defense role and so on and so forth as well, but primarily NASA. Now, in saying that, keep in mind that 90 to 95% of the money that's been spent by NASA actually goes to private contractors. That's always been the case. If I have it here, yeah. I believe I can put for example, the entire NASA space program went from 46,700 people. That was in 1960. This is before Kennedy's speech right here in Houston announcing the endeavor to go to the moon, to put a man on the moon. So we went from 46,000 to a peak of 411,000 people in NASA in 1965. All right? But in that period, we went from 8,000 people to 36,000 people that are actually directly employed by NASA. That is, at the peak, we only had 36,000 people working for NASA at the peak point of the NASA program, putting man on the moon. The rest of it was farmed out. Maybe farmed out isn't the best word for it, but the idea is we had contractors. NASA was drawing up the strategy, the plans, right? People, Warner von Braun, Kraft Erica, other people were the leading scientists, rocket scientists. You had the designs, then you had the construction of these things, of these rockets, these huge rockets, you know, including right over here in New Orleans, the Michoud facility built the Saturn V's, for example, the original Saturn V's that were the key rocket for the Apollo programs and the first space labs. So we've always had this contracting relationship of NASA with a broad array of contractors in the private sector, and a close collaboration, which is part of what allowed the space program to do what it did as successfully as it did within less than a decade in terms of putting a man on the moon. But what's occurring now is what is happening now is that we're now migrating out the manpower, what hasn't retired, the knowledge base, and actually the physical stock of NASA over to private companies who are then carrying out what they promote. SpaceX is a singular example. Elon Musk and SpaceX are now touting as their space projects, their homegrown projects, which they're building as if it was something out of, Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged book, of the figure, the so-called heroic figure who basically moves up into the mountains and starts his own work, his own insulated empire, right? And which is completely contrary to the facts of the matter. If you take, for example, SpaceX, SpaceX is, well, here, let's summarize it this way. We are not, and we're nowhere near being in a position right now of anybody building a Saturn V. We don't have the capability right now to go to the moon, to take human beings, a crew, to the moon, much less to Mars. We don't have that kind of thrust capability. We don't have those engines. And so at this point, NASA, on its limited budget, it's gone at maximum, just so you have the idea in mind, NASA's maximum budget, this includes all of the contracting out and so forth, this is all covered under this, was a maximum of less than 5, or probably 4.5% of the entire federal budget. That's the maximum of it ever was, 4.5%. Now it's down to about 0.45, pennies, 4.5 pennies out of every dollar in federal tax money goes to NASA. But under the new space launch system program that's been put in place by the budget passed by the U.S. Congress under the Obama administration, which became effective in 2011, I believe it was 2011, 2012. We're going to get, the idea is hopefully to get to Mars by 2033. 2033, okay? Musk, on the other hand, says he can get us there in roughly 10 years. But he hasn't built the rockets that will do this.
That's the question. It's like, do you have any reason not to like that P-38 with the 400-foot wingspan of SpaceX's? I mean, it looks to me like a better idea.
I'm going to go along here with what is being proposed in terms of SpaceX for getting to Mars.
I'm talking about launching a space vehicle from 90,000 feet or something.
I'm sorry. I'm not going to get into a lot of side discussions, but the approach of SpaceX is building. They have the Falcon 9 now, which is is taking cargo now to the space station, the International Space Station. They'll then move to the Falcon Heavy, which will do a little bit more. Then they'll move to the Falcon Extra Heavy, or it's called, there's the Falcon 9, the Falcon Heavy, the Falcon Extra Heavy, and then the Falcon XX, I think is what it's called. At that point, you might be up to the level of a Saturn V in terms of thrust and cargo capacity, more or less. But even the Heavy, the Falcon Heavy, which hasn't been built, and the first flight of it is now projected for next year, is merely a Falcon 9 with a couple of strapped-on, boosters, and is a fraction, like 3/5 at most of the Saturn. And you've got to keep in mind, we built the Saturns. NASA built the Saturns 30 years ago, 40 years ago, actually. Starting in the 1960s, they built the Saturns. So it's been roughly 45, 50 years since they first began building the Saturns. Now, there's a number of stories that I could tell on this in this regard. Keep in mind that SpaceX, and again, this more or less I'm not singling I'm only singling out SpaceX because it's supposedly the most advanced and certainly the most hyped space startup program. But keep in mind that it was only started in the 2000s. If I remember right, it was started in, let me see if I can find quickly, 2002. Yeah, I was thinking 2002 it was started. Elon Musk and a guy named Mueller, Tom Mueller, in 2002. Within 2 years, it had its first contract with NASA without having sent up a single rocket. All right, so I mean, again, we've always contracted out. The difference here is now what we're doing, what NASA is doing is contracting out operations. Right, the Apollo program, other aspects of the space program have always been operated by NASA. They were drawn up by NASA, the specifications and so forth. They were built in collaboration with NAFTA. They tapped the capabilities of NAFTA, and so, or NASA, excuse me. But then they were also operated by NASA with all of the capabilities in terms of flight control, all of the knowledge, all of the decades of experience. So Elon Musk comes along within 2 years. This is the guy that made his fortune with PayPal. As far as I know, that's not something that really, gives you a background in space science. Okay, this is a guy from Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, background in finance. So he's gonna build up a space program, but immediately within 2 years, under the let's see, 2002. Yeah, Bush. Bush came in 2001, January of 2001. So, and then when he's running out of money because he's gotten four or five of the Falcons 1s off the ground, when the first 3 crash, blow up in space and so on and so forth, and Tesla is about to go underwater. That's his automobile firm that he's also famous for, the Tesla electric cars, 100,000 plus cars. They're not coming off the assembly line. He's losing money on all fronts. Lo and behold, along comes under Obama another NASA contract is given to SpaceX. Right? They've lost the majority of their rockets so far, and are on the verge of going under. And they're bailed out by NASA with a new contract to send up cargo and eventually crews to the space station. And flights to the space station are supposed to start now next year. At the same time, remember this is what's the time frame here? 2008. Okay, 2008. Obama enters the White House, and in that time frame, a $500 million loan, low-interest loan, is provided to Tesla alongside General Motors and so forth as part of the bailout of the so-called bailout of the auto industry that was carried out in the middle of the financial crash, the 2007-2008 financial crash. So Elon Musk, who's presented as a Iron Man, named so not after the marathon, but after the comic book figure, but I assume that marathon is actually named after the comic book figure too, I'm not sure. Elon Musk, who presents himself as the Iron Man, as the invincible individual entrepreneur, has continually been bailed out again and again and again by his political connections on Wall Street and the White House, and so that's what we have going now. Just to extrapolate on this a little bit. SpaceX, Elon Musk, we're talking about the privatized space programs. I've compared it to the, people remember the tragedy of this space shuttle Columbia coming in and disintegrating on re-entry. And I compared to what the space program is now more and more looking like the debris spread out across the countryside from the Columbia disaster, because it's being diffused out into dozens of separate space programs who are all developing their own operational capacities. And this is going to be a huge barrier to getting the kind of space program the United States needs going, and to get the kind of international cooperation that's required to actually meet the larger threats and to solve the larger problems to our advantage by going to the galactic level. So that's what we're talking about here, just an overview. But in just the last, I think it's now been, it's been over a year, I believe. SpaceX was given authorization, received security clearance to begin flying Department of Defense satellites into space. Okay, so they're now on the inside track on military contracts as well as with NASA. And they're they've stated explicitly that they're going to be able to put satellites in orbit. These are, of course, LEO, low Earth orbit satellites, for around 100 million a pop, as opposed to the 160 million a pop that United Launch Services, which is Lockheed and Boeing, a conglomerate they created, has been putting them up for. Now, I bring that up just because I want to emphasize that what is the thinking, and again, this is not just SpaceX. This is a problem across the board, and Joel has really stressed this to me in some of the discussion we've had. Is what's the approach here? It's to do it cheap, it's to do it fast, and to make money. Okay, this is the opposite of what the attack is made that to go for man to go to the moon within 10 years that Kennedy ordered. Well, that was a gold-plated program because we had to do it and cost was no object. But that's what you do with a science driver. If you want to bust the limits of current knowledge, that's the kind of thing you do. I mean, you don't squander money, but you basically have to go along several different pathways simultaneous to find the solutions that you need. And in the process, you'll learn a lot of other things too. And it's the same in medical science and so on and so forth. It's a science driver approach, a crash program, if you will, a Manhattan project type approach, like we had with the to develop the A-bomb back in the 40s. It requires the same kind of approach. But well, that's the criticism. So they're saying, no, we don't need this. We don't need this kind of a institutionalized, what's become the institutionalized way of operating. We can do it cheap, we can do it fast, and we can make a profit on it. Now, I'm going to switch stories here, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Virgin Galactic. Have people heard about Virgin or Virgin Airlines? You know about Sir Richard Branson, and he's that silver coiffed jet setter and so forth and so on, right? Does that ring a bell? Yeah. Well, whether you have heard, right? Space flight person. Oh, yeah. He for Virgin Airlines he owns. Then he created Virgin Galactic, and Virgin Galactic began offering at $200,000 a seat the tickets to go up to on suborbital, to go up basically where you lose gravity and you float around, and it's kind of a space experience, and then you come back down. And so he began they ordered the construction. They began constructing rocket-powered craft that would be able to do this. These would be launched from planes, I believe. They would launch off of a plane, of a large plane, but they're rocket-powered, and then they'd take their passengers, their tourists, space tourism, right? This is a part of this gambit of this privatized space program, that there's money. Another feature of this that will make money is this kind of thing. Well, remember, we're still talking about, this is just suborbital. Okay, well, in 2014, October 31st, Spaceship 2, that was the name of it, Spaceship 2, one of the first two craft, broke up in test flight at 40,000 feet. And one of the two pilots died in the accident. Now, these things happen, but that's the point. Space programs, rockets, rocket engines, millions of pounds of thrust, and so on and so forth. This is not, this is not a walk in the park, to say the least. All right. But if you're going to, it is rocket science. Yeah. It is rocket science. Yeah. Yes. Well put, yes. It is rocket science. Rocket science is still rocket science. Now that was October 31st, 2014. Now let me quote the chief executive of Virgin Galactic in the London Guardian, the Guardian newspaper of London, October 9th, right? So this is less than 3 weeks before this tragedy, right? We've changed dramatically as a company. When I joined in 2010, which is when the company was created, we were mostly a marketing organization selling tickets. Right now, we can design, build, test, and fly a rocket motor all by ourselves, and all in the Mojave, which I don't think is done anywhere else on the planet. I don't know if it strikes you as in the same way as it strikes me. But here's a guy, he's the chief executive, his name is Whiteside, George Whitesides, chief executive of Virgin Galactic, being quoted in London Guardian, saying, when I joined in 2010, we were a marketing organization. But now, here we are, we're building and testing and flying rocket motors. Yeah, gee whiz, isn't this great? Right? Cheap, fast, and will make a profit. Okay? Well, as a result of the breakup of Spaceship 2, Virgin Galactic isn't flying any flights. Okay? And I'm sure they still intend to. But this is, I think this is just a window on the hubris, right? The hubris, like, if you will, Icarus, flying too close to the sun. Hubris in the sense of denial of your own
lack of knowledge.
Lack of knowledge, yeah. Exactly. Well put. So, of course, it's not the only. Besides the SpaceX, I mean, you have Orbital Sciences. They've lost, in the last year or so, they've lost one of their rockets carrying cargo up to the space station. They're supposed to begin flying crews up there. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
And SpaceX, also just a matter of months ago, earlier this year, lost also a rocket carrying cargo up to the International Space Station. And they're supposed to start either next year or the year after, 2016, 2017. They're supposed to start delivering
with people
up to the space station. Okay.
That's scary.
So this is, this is okay. So this is a feature of what's going on here. We can also talk about space stations. Bigelow Space the guy made his money, you know, his multi-millions, you know, he's a billionaire. I don't know if he's actually a billionaire, but, you know, he's one of these quote-unquote billionaires that Bernie Sanders might rant against or whatever. But anyway, but he made his money in American suites, hotel suites, motels. That's what he made his money in. Well, Bigelow, he then started, his name is Bigelow, he started Bigelow Space based in Nevada. Then they brought the rights to technology that NASA was developing to build inflatable space stations or inflatable compartments that could be added on to space stations, because it costs a lot of money to send, you know, huge amounts of cargo up to the space station, particularly when you've canceled the programs that would have gotten you there, you know, safely and in large enough cargo loads that you could do it more economically. That was the problem with the shuttle, was the small cargo loads that the shuttle locked us into in building the space station. It stretched out the building of the space station over years. But Bigelow bought the technology for these to build these that was being developed. It wasn't fully developed, and now he's planning to build commercial space stations made out of, you know, inflatable materials like Kevlar. It's basically like the equivalent of Kevlar, like, you know, the police use for body armor. Yeah, and further, he wants to put a settlement on the moon in these inflatable compartments, inflatable settlements. Or he thought, well, he starts spending some money on this beyond what NASA did the initial work on. He spent some money. He's put $250 million into this whole thing now, and he's now, besides his everything else he's got going on, NASA has now come back to him, and they're now buying back the rights from him to use the technology they sold him in the first place. Okay? The only good thing I can see of all that is that it shows you how we could reintegrate these privatized space programs back into NASA. We can, you know, work out, you know, by various means to corral it back, you know, back into the corral, I suppose.
being the director, NASA being the director again. Yeah.
But so you have these. So you have the cargo loads going up, you know, from these so-called spaceports. Now you have crews that are supposed to go up, you know, within the next 2 years. Then you have you have a privatized proposal program to go to the moon and set up a refueling station in the orbit around the moon, mining the moon for O2 or H2O2 fuel, rocket propellant fuel. Well, no, they're after just H2O2, just what's used for chemical rockets today. And they think they can. It has to start out using federal funds. But if the federal government, if NASA will essentially shut down its space launch system, the new SLS program that was inaugurated under Obama after shutting down the Constellation program, and so on, which shutting down the Constellation program, they also shut down the shuttle program and so on and so forth. But if the SLS program now cuts back to only a couple of launches, and the money is diverted to NextGen or whatever umbrella is created by NextGen and its friends, they'll be able to go up to the moon with that money, and after a few years of drinking from the cup of NASA, they'll be able to begin making money by selling rocket fuel to passing tourists, I guess, passing rockets that, on their way to the Mars or wherever, or back and forth return trips and so on and so forth. So there's a multitude of these different projects. You know, Amazon.com, this guy, was it Bezos, is it pronounce it? He has Blue Origin. And so now Bezos, of course, if you can run a company that didn't show a profit for umpteen years, that's less important than some things. But if you run a company that doesn't produce anything, I mean, I don't know of anything Amazon produces. I mean, maybe there's something, but I don't know.
The Kindle.
The Kindle. They produce the Kindle,
And
it's
movies.
pointed out, and movies. Do they produce movies now? Maybe
Yes,
they do. Okay.
they're internet.
Well, now he's gonna make a real life production in Florida, and intends to launch in a few years, with the ultimate intention of going to the moon and so on, because he's got the money. Because he's got the money. Now, you should also know, and that brings up another point. I know I'm kind of skipping here from subjects, but I hope it's coherent. Where are they launching from? Well, Bezos is going to launch from Cape Canaveral. He's got a lease on one of the launch pads at Cape Canaveral. Okay, where's SpaceX going to launch from? In terms of of its Falcon Heavy, it's going to launch from JFK in Florida. So the NASA is now privatizing or has turning JFK into a public-private partnership, in which private companies essentially are given the hardware and the capabilities which they couldn't build themselves, right? Or if they built it, it would take them, decades, right? And so again, this is, as I've given several examples of, they're taking the wherewithal, which is not only the property of NASA, it's the property of the American people. I don't want to say the taxpayer because this is not about my tax money. This is about the fact that we have a patrimony. A lot of people contributed to this, built these capabilities up, and now we're selling it off at a garage sale. And we're selling it off to people who are not competent to do what at least they aspire to do. The more fundamental point I want to make about this space privatization effort is, well, two things. One is, the old adage is, in terms of doing it fast, doing it cheap, and making a profit. If you do it fast, you usually can't do it cheap, and you may or may not make a profit. If you make it fast, it's not going to be cheap, and you probably won't make a profit. In other words, you can't do it fast, cheap, and make a profit in the real world. The world doesn't operate that way. That's connected to this. None of this drives science. Like I said, none of this, we were doing this 45 years ago. The NASA, the Saturn V rockets were doing what none of these rockets could do or even projected to do. And we did it 45 years ago. Going to the ISS, NASA's been doing that for a decade, 2 decades. It's been doing it for a long time. Decade and a half.
International Space Station.
International Space Station, yes. Right? Yes, we've privatized over a period of several presidential administrations. We privatized the satellite launches. So there's many, like the United Space Launch. We have numbers of companies launching satellites into space. Other people do that too. And Roscosmos and others, like the Russian space program company and so on, do these for they launch other countries, other people's satellites into space and so on. And that's a normal process of technology transfer into the private sector out of cutting edge research. So that's good. It's like thinking about commercial nuclear reactors as a spin-off of what was originally the Manhattan Project. which was a government program, obviously. But what these guys are doing all involves trying to replicate aspects of what has already been done by the best of our people, and so it's you know, it's not the hype. It doesn't measure up. We're not going to put. Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. He says he wants to die there. I mean, we assume he doesn't want to die trying to land there. We assume, okay, and like I said, he wants to get the first ones up there within 10 years. I mean, you have also, just so you know, I mean, there's Mars Direct, which is really kind of a byproduct of Mars One. Mars One was like Mars One Way. That's what I meant, Mars One. Well, Mars Direct is the same thing. Mars Direct says we're going to send people one way to Mars because it's a lot cheaper. It's a lot cheaper. We'll send them there. We'll send them there with their, you know, hydrated gels with seeds for corn or whatever, and you know, and we're going to send them not across the Atlantic to Plymouth Colony. We're going to send them right to Mars one way. And we're looking. Right, there's 100,000 people who have signed up. You know, wanting to become one of the people that will be part of this first Mars Direct project, which expects to get to Mars roughly within the next 15 years or so. And they contracted with, you know, I think it's Lockheed was the one I heard mentioned or read. They've contracted anyway with one or more of the space programs to build the facility, you know, to build the rockets, to build the whatever that'll get them up there. You know, but if you don't see, again, there's no science breakthroughs in this. Because they're talking about chemical propulsion. They're talking about H2O2 chemical rockets, which is what they use, which is what they use now, right?
That'd be a long trip.
And because it takes a lot of fuel to get up there, right? I mean, you know, you're just a figure.
How long would it take to get there?
On the Saturn, the gross mass of the Saturn V rocket is 5,040,000 pounds. Okay, so you can figure that out in terms of tons. Okay, but anyway, 5,040,000 pounds. That's how much it weighed. That was full gross weight with fuel. You know how much it weighs empty? 287,000 pounds. So you're going from 5 million to 287,000. Okay, all of that is fuel. Right? Well, if you don't have to come back, it means, you know, you don't have to worry about, you know, all of those costs. You can do it cheap. You can do it fast. And if there's enough suckers out there, we can make them, you know, we can make money on them, right? Now, SpaceX isn't saying that, you know, SpaceX isn't saying that, but it's the same, you know, it's the same approach. They're also planning to do it on chemical propulsion. Now, there's a whole range to do with serious. Look, let's a little more on the science. I mean, again, this gets back to the galactic principle, and I think we're kind of running here in terms of time, or we got 5 or 10 more minutes. Okay. They're planning to do this all on, as I said, with chemical propulsion, with rockets, traditional rockets. But there's other spacecraft, right? They were at level 5, or class 5 maybe is the terminology, at NASA with nuclear rockets, nuclear engines, back in the 1960s. They were ready to put a nuclear rocket engine on the upper stages of the Saturn V. Because they had developed to the point that they had the thrust you know, that they and because they obviously used a hell of a lot less fuel. In other words, you're talking about tiny amounts of fuel as opposed to millions of gallons. And you're also not dealing with the same kinds of insulation, like H2O2. These are liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen. These have to be kept at cryogenic temperatures. So you're talking about insulation. You're talking all of this as part of what's got to be built into the structure of your rockets, right? To be able to, to handle this fuel, keep it safe, and utilize it. If you go to rocket engines, and there's nuclear thermal, as well as straight rocket propulsion, which was the first kind that they were working with. You can generate the same kinds of thrusts or more, even double, if you're willing to accept weight for a larger nuclear engine. In terms of just the weight of the engine itself, not the fuel. You can get twice the thrust. I mean, we already knew that in the 60s. We built the engine. Class 6 meant that we were ready to put a rocket engine on a Saturn and send it up, for test flights, right? And that's when the program was shut down. That's part of the budget, cuts that were done, going in the late 60s, into the 70s. And then there's fusion. One of the factors that we haven't touched on, and this is going back to the galactic, is cosmic rays. And the other factors, as some of you know, that you're dealing with in terms of travel in outer space. We have a crew right now up in the space station, right? And one of the gentlemen, one of the twin brothers, I can't remember his name. Scott Kelly is up there on a full one year duration visit to the space station, which is really stretching it. The Russians have done this. We really haven't done this before, to test the conditions. In this case, more the conditions of weightlessness than the questions of cosmic radiation and so forth. But once you go further out into deep space, like going to Mars, you're dealing with extraordinary conditions in terms of this factor. Ian, can you see down there? It's probably around the third or fourth one that says something about cosmic radiation in the title. Can you put that up? Yeah. Thanks. He's going to put it up for the video, but it'll also come up here. Oh yeah. Okay. All right. Here's some figures. This is fusion, so that's even further out there. But take a look at this in terms of calculations, in terms of radiation doses, in terms of going to Mars. And we have current technology, nuclear thermal, which I was just talking about briefly, introducing briefly, and then fusion driven. Look at current technology, chemical rockets, 400 grams. Is it grams? Oh no, that's in terms of. No. Okay. 400 MSVs is the limit for a 25-year-old accepting a 3% risk of fatal cancer. Is 400 MSVs, and that's, if you see it, that's that blue dotted line there. Can you see that all? Okay.
What's that, 400?
That's 400. Here's 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000. All right. And so here's current technology here, and a long stay, 525 days. A short day is in red, and then they even vary the amount, solid bar versus dash bar, in terms of the amount of shielding that's provided on the spaceship, right? That's taking you there. Okay.
So it's
But you're looking at rates, right? Approximately double.
It's cosmic rays we're measuring.
Right. Radiation of all kinds.
Okay.
X-rays, gamma rays, you name it. Yeah. And and the effects up here, are not known in terms of their, because they're just so far off the charts, right? But if you see here with nuclear thermal, you get down in the range where you begin to say, well, maybe with additional shielding, which also becomes possible because your weight of your ship is less, and so forth, so forth, we can get down we're getting down below the level. But you can see you're still playing with fire. Just in terms of radiation, again, you're talking about, year-long stays on going to and back and on Mars, right? So these are extended periods under conditions in which you're, deep flux radiation you're experiencing. But if you go down to fusion-driven rockets, thermonuclear fusion as opposed to fission, right? You're talking about being able to reduce the times, the time of the trip, and then and therefore the consequences of these trips. In other words, from 210 days to get there to 150 days down to 30 days, you're reducing the amount of radiation that your crew is going to be experiencing. Obviously, still subject to this question of shielding and so on. Right? But these are dramatic, right? Now, 30 days is based on, see, a difference between nuclear and fusion. Fusion rockets are obviously where we want to go to, but nuclear is being revived in fusion, ion. There's different combinations that are being discussed, but with fusion, we can go to 1G acceleration. This deals with the gravity question. With 1G acceleration, that is, you accelerate such that you're maintaining, at least after initial liftoff, you're maintaining a 1G acceleration. In other words, it feels like you're on Earth. The gravitation that you're feeling is the Earth's a artificial Earth's gravitation in the spaceship, right? So you're able to walk around. You're under normal gravitational conditions. That means problems such as bone loss and other things that we associate with space travel are nullified, at least so far as we can account for that so far.
Down. It's like you just reverse the engines for the second half of the trip.
Right, the second half, yeah. You reverse engines, or however it's configured, yeah. But that's the effect. And then you decelerate at 1G at the midpoint. In your trips, you're maintaining 1G, decelerate, all right? So the gravitational problem, at least so far as we understand it, goes out the window. And by shortening the trip to 30 days from currently 200 days average, it depends. I mean, these things change all the time. I mean, 2033 is posed by NASA as a rough idea of when we want to go to Mars, because that's the next best lineup between the Earth and Mars, a minimum in terms of travel between the two, not just the closest, but in terms of their orbitals and so forth. It's the best lineup. But anyway, from 210 days, we'll say roughly, to 30 days, that means the exposure to radiation obviously is slashed. And as Mr. LaRouche has pointed out, you'll end up with, the person when you get to Mars, he's this puddle of goo on the bottom of the spaceship floor, with basically no body and no functioning capabilities, which is a possibility until we've done it and we know these things and learn more about them. So, so if you're going to go to Mars, this is the way you want to go to Mars. But none of these proposals, right? None of these proposals by any of these privatized companies are talking about taking people, any people, whether it's people chosen out of 100,000 volunteers, for a one-way flight, or the next gen study and whatever comes out of that is a more fleshed out proposal. I haven't gotten into that, but which was a study done, partly paid for by NASA. It's ridiculous. Or any of these other, the SpaceX proposal. None of these proposals involve these advanced propulsion systems. these are spaceships. They're not really rockets because they're using a different propulsion systems. You know, if you want to be picky about it, I guess. So if we're going to have a space program from this, thank you, from the standpoint of a coherent space program, operate from the standpoint of what mankind's needs are in terms of taking control of our weather cycles, in terms of asteroid and comet defense. It's not just asteroids, it's comets as well. And other things that we don't even know about, that we need to take control of, and by taking control of can improve the conditions not only for life on Earth, but actually improve the solar system itself and beyond. We've got to reintegrate into a new national space effort, whether it's a reconfigured and robustly funded NASA program, or it's a new, you know, a new structure. However that has to be worked through, it's got to be worked through from the standpoint of some of the advanced concepts that I've at least indicated here, and avoiding the fatal flaws of space privatization. That Consumer Reports, when the Tesla, I think it's the latest model of the Tesla, the SUV or whatever it is, came out on production. It was immediately given the highest rating as a tremendous car, smooth running, no problems, just great, and so forth. Well, within a matter of months, there were getting so many complaints coming in from consumers who had bought these cars that they publicly announced, Consumer Reports publicly announced that they were withdrawing their ratings on the Tesla model, on this Tesla model. I mean, I think one of the most fundamental things often overlooked is embedded in this concept of what LaRouche in particular, but also scientists, I think, to a significant degree, understand generally, and engineers, is that when you're taught, scientific principles are principles that involve how things operate, but also how they, and then you have to take these principles and say, how do they interact? You know, if you're building the suspension of a car, you're involving a lot of different types of mechanical energy and mechanical processes that have to fit together and work together. I mean, if you think of, you know, shock absorbers and springs and U-joints and you know, and so on and so forth. So if you take it again, if you're trying to do it fast and you're trying to do it cheap and you're trying to do it and make a profit, and you're trying to turn out a car, you're trying to start an automobile company from scratch and start turning out $100,000 cars, you know, in a matter of a few years, you're going to run into big problems. You know, not to mention the fact that it seems kind of crazy that you got 7,000, you know, batteries in a 7,000, I think is the number, batteries in a Tesla to operate the thing. You know, it's these batteries that come out of the development of laptop computers. I mean, am I wrong, Joel, or is it lithium batteries? Yeah, yeah. You got thousands of them in the car to make it operate. I mean, you know, there's a kind of inherent kind of craziness to the whole idea that this is the way forward for mankind. Is but these problems anyway. So these problems popped up with Tesla, and it goes to the point that, and then think about building rockets and rocket engines. I mean, he did go with Tom Mueller. I mean, that's, you know, granted, Elon Musk hired Tom Mueller, who was like one of the rocket specialists for Rockwell, I think it was. Anyway, it was one of their top rocket engine building, you know, whiz kids. But even so, I mean, you know, you don't just draw this on a CAD computer and then assemble it and shoot it off. You know, I'm oversimplifying, but I know they're not doing that. But I hope you see my point. Yeah, go ahead, Joel. What were you doing?
Oh, the other thing about the batteries
Yeah.
is that in cold weather, your charge goes down. So there was a test run from Newark to Connecticut.
Uh-huh.
It was the coldest weekend, and the car stopped halfway to its destination.
Ah.
Couldn't they?
And when it stops, the wheels lock. So you get to get towed a flatbed to get to its destination.
All right.
Oh.
If I don't know, do you think that carried on to the,
No, you should repeat.
just
it.
Joel Dijon was just saying, an engineer here, nuclear engineer, was saying that electrical engineer, nuclear as well. But I was just saying that in terms of the case of the Tesla, one of the not just a story, not a fable, but the actual test drive of a Tesla was in very cold winter weather. And it's known that these lithium batteries run down faster, correct me if I'm wrong, run down faster in cold weather. So in the trip with the Tesla, halfway across from New York or wherever to the Midwest, it just shut down. And when the batteries shut down, the engine shuts down, the wheels lock. So it had to be picked up on a flatbed and hauled the rest of the way to its destination. So that's one of the, there you go, design flaw in the super sports car of Elon Musk's Tesla. A lesson to the wise.
He was counting on global warming.
Oh, Joel commented he was counting on global warming. Didn't work out. All right.
You're going to say it's like virtually all toy airplanes anymore, radio controlled, use lithium polymer batteries. Okay, and nobody uses little two-stroke engines for those anymore. As far as a car or anything like that, I wouldn't even bother with any sort of electrical car until they have supercapacitors that work. I wouldn't want something like that to use batteries.
Anything else?
Yeah,
Question, comment?
where do you think the space program how it should fund and do it? Then if it's not, if the privatized model isn't going to work, for the reasons you've talked about, what do you see as a good way to do it?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Well, as I indicated, and this is what Mr. LaRouche and our science team have outlined. So I think I'm sticking pretty much to what, you know, to what how it's been assessed by us, by LaRouche PAC and our science people, is the key right now is something that Ted mentioned a little while ago, helium-3 is kind of the key here, in the sense that helium-3, as most of you know, helium-3 is the perfect fuel for fusion reactors and for fusion power in a couple of different forms. But helium-3, by all intents and purposes, other than from the breakdown of tritium in small amounts, is only really available to us on the moon. And it's been proposed by a number of people, and the Chinese are the Chinese space program is intent, at least in terms of a conception, that it's not adopted as policy, official policy, but they're definitely been seriously looking at this for some time, and it probably is where they're going, is they're planning to go to the moon to get helium-3, both as the source of the fuel required to make fusion energy viable on Earth, which will end our energy scarcity problems, period. But also then, of course, that becomes the fuel for the use in fusion-powered rockets. I'll just add that you don't need, or at least according to some of NASA scientists, you don't need helium-3 for fusion rockets necessarily. That you can use tritium, deuterium, the fuel combination, tritium, deuterium, which is readily available here, because in space you don't need the kind of shielding to prevent the escape of neutrons, and all that goes with it. So in outer space you can travel, like say from Moon to Mars, and that's advantage of fission and fusion propulsion systems, as these propulsion systems are continuous power as opposed to what you think of in terms of rockets, in terms of a massive thrust, and then you've launched the vehicle and it just travels on its momentum, until its next stage blasts off, and again you get a propulsion, and then it coasts further. With fission and fusion, you have continuous power supplies. So there's a lot of, that's another feature of this. But nonetheless, in terms of rough outline, what we've stressed is we want to get from here to Mars. We want to get there to mine helium-3, among other resources on the moon. There's lots of resources on the moon, all kinds of resources. But we'll probably want to use it up there. We'll probably want to build up capabilities on the moon, both for asteroid defense, among other things, but for many scientific reasons, for the dark side of the moon, for telescopes to look further into the galaxy. We have the James Webb launch slated for 2018. That'll be the largest space telescope mankind's ever built, and it's going to be launched into deep space as opposed to nearby space like the current Hubble telescope is. So it has to go out there, and we won't be able to go out and fix it, at least for now. So it's got to be done right, and it's going to go like out 1,000,000 miles. So it's then going to be able to look way deep into space. But from the moon, we're going to be able to do similar kinds of incredible things, from the standpoint of looking deeper into space and looking into the phenomena of space in terms of what's going on out there, in terms of dark matter, in terms of so-called dark holes, and all the rest. So we want to go from the Earth to the moon. We want to develop the moon. We want to have permanent settlements there, and then from the moon, launch with continuous propulsion spaceships. And we'll probably want to send several at a time on to Mars, and from Mars on elsewhere. But as well, from what my understanding of it is because of the nature of what we're talking about in terms of a galactic science driver, and and what's involved in that, as much as we can comprehend, or at least as much as I comprehend it, is that this really kind of turns things in a certain way upside down, in that what we do with unmanned missions and what we do with, including space telescopes and so forth, becomes much, much more important, because we're going to go out into the galaxy beyond our solar system, with eyes, so to speak, with capabilities, with cameras, with infrared, with gamma ray capable instruments, and so on and so forth. This is not going to involve people. It may involve people operating from Mars, or even from satellites, moons of Jupiter or whatever. We can speculate, but in terms of maintenance and so forth, large phased array radar systems that span between asteroids or between moons and this kind of thing. They take in a large, basically creating large aperture telescopes, in certain domains. Those are the elements of what a new space program would involve. That would require, first of all, it involves Glass-Steagall. It involves a national credit system. It then means setting up either a much expanded NASA program with a much expanded budget, at least up to the level of what it was at the heyday of the space program back in 66, 67 in terms of its budget. At least, including a new cooperative contracting arrangement with private sector industries and so on and so forth. It'll involve all that. There was another feature that was coming to mind.
Collaboration.
Hmm?
Collaboration.
Yes, and collaboration with other nations, because we're not going to be able to do what's going to need to be done, by ourselves. And we would have been hard put to do it anyway if we hadn't shut down the space program, over the intervening last 4 decades. But certainly going into the projects of the future and the nature of these problems, like the question of asteroid defense, as I said, we either do it together or we're obviously going to be at each other's throats at some point. Go ahead.
Okay, this SpaceX device, which looks like a P-38 with a 400-foot wingspan. I mean, I like the idea of, there's one company in the world which I would feel pretty good about wanting to try to build something like that, and that would be Antonov, which has built some of the most gigantic aircraft that fly, including the 225, right, which is the most gigantic aircraft that flies very nicely. Has anybody looked into the possibility of
I couldn't say, and I really don't want to speculate in that area.
What's our estimated time for having fusion-propelled rockets?
Well, that's
Crash program.
well, yeah, crash. I mean, all of this requires a crash effort in terms of. One way of thinking about it, though, is that the development of fusion rocket engines to give us 1G acceleration will be a good way to then develop the very systems that we need for asteroid defense. It'll give us the capability. In other words, asteroid defense, you've got to have, obviously you've got to have observation. You've got to identify what's out there. And you have a private foundation that's trying to put a infrared telescope out there, the B612 Foundation. But that's only a 5-year project to do an ongoing. That's just a mapping project. That's useful, even if it happens. I mean, it's funded out of Silicon Valley. It's part of this whole mishmash with Elon Musk and all these other guys. So, if Wall Street collapses tomorrow, which it will, these guys will be millionaires at best, as opposed to billionaires, and then all of these nice ideas will go poof, right? I mean, it's so we're going to have to do it. They're not going to do it,
right? Unless it's a national mission, a national policy,
right?
Yeah.
But from what I can tell you, just briefly, is a fusion engine for a Professor Slow, John Slow at the University of Washington, is part of heading up a team for NASA that's has a specific approach to this, which is useful. And we covered this in this issue of 21st Century Planetary Defense. That it's easy. It'll be easier. It's easier to develop a fusion energy for space than it is on Earth. You're not going to use a tokamak approach.
Right.
It's a huge, monstrous machine. I mean, they're working on a deal that basically collapses a field in a lithium shielding in on the fuel and to create compression. And the initial driving in is done off of solar panels in space to initiate this process. And then the lithium shield literally creates the ions, which then are shot out the back end of the fusion rocket to drive the system forward with twice the capacity or more than twice the capacity of any chemical rocket, and it can do it on a continuous basis. Now that's theoretical, but theoretically it works, and it's they're at level 2 or 3 or whatever it's called in terms of working this thing through, in terms of actually building getting to the point of building a prototype. They have working test facilities at the University of Washington. So but I beyond my judgment. But it seems like you could do it within 5 or 10 years. You could have fusion rockets.
That was part of my question. Was for space, it's a shorter period of time than it is for land use.
Right.
Right.
Different systems.
Different systems
Can work, and like part of what he's saying is that he can work with deuterium and tritium. He doesn't have to have helium-3.
because he doesn't have to worry about out there. Deuterium, tritium produces a lot of neutrons, and neutrons, damage equipment and are not useful for propulsion. Because you can't direct them. If they're charged particles, you can direct them by magnetic field, right? You can create a field and channel them, right, for propulsion. But neutrons, you can't corral them. But in space, you don't. His point is you don't have to worry about them. So I'm not trying to be the whiz kid here and knows all the ins and outs, but essentially. A lot of the problems that we do have to master for fusion on Earth go away when we're talking about doing it in space. So that may be the first place we develop.
Well, the one thing to think about in consideration of all of this, which a lot of these privatized people don't, is the question of the role of the human mind,
yes,
per se,
yes,
and human discovery, and not just what you said. We want to do something just because we want to do it, because we want to do it on the cheap. We want to say, we can make a profit on it, or we're the first ones to do it, or it's a competitive competition just to say that we went to Mars. But what does that actually give back to the contributions of understanding the role of human beings and making discoveries about what's there in our solar system, what's there in our galaxy, what's there in our universe? Right. It's interesting. We went to Ian and I last night went to a play. Joe's not in here. Joe got us some tickets about the lady. Her name is Henrietta Leavitt, who's discovered, who is a scientist, astronomer, one of the first female astronomers, who actually discovered the relationships between how you measure the distances between stars and illumination of stars and how far away stars are. And at a certain point, what people believed couldn't even be possible from the standpoint that if stars are so many billion light years away, that they can even be that far away, then maybe there's other galaxies out there more than our own. Now, you wouldn't just fall upon that. You would have to actually have a science driver, and you have to have a passion to figure out what you're looking for. And then also, the only species that would be able to even do something like that is human beings. Right. So that's really interesting. Well, which these guys don't have any conception of whatsoever. Right.
And that's really goes back to answering Ian's question. I mean, because really more important, you can define elements of the mission and what a real space program would look like today. And you can, and then you can talk about, well, how would we finance it? So that can all be debated and discussed. But if you go back to John F. Kennedy, really he answered the question. How is it that the American people, in this case, be mobilized, for a great cause, which means mobilize their own inherent human creative capacities to master the unknown. And that's really the heart of the, how do we do it, or what do we do? That's the key, is how do we communicate this? How do we profoundly engage the American people? Which is what we're doing with this presentation, and what our science team is doing, and so on. But yes, it is this issue of human creativity and discovering that quality again in ourselves that makes these great adventures possible and the great results.
Is that still available? I know I have one, but for others?
I believe it's available in reprint. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really nice one.
Go to 21stcenturytech.com, www.21stcenturytech.com, or call the office here, 713-541-2907. Might as well
Good.
give a phone number here as well.
And the month,
And we'll try to find some.
the month of the issue.
Yeah, this is fall winter 2012, 2013,
Yeah.
titled Planetary Defense. It's also the presentation on the conference in Ukraine that occurred in 2012, which our basement team, Ben Dennison and Jason Ross attended from our basement team and gave presentations at, which is on the strategic defense of Earth. This was coming off of the Russian proposal for the joint development of a strategic defense of Earth, coming off of the Strategic Defense Initiative of LaRouche, which Reagan had announced, back in 1983. So here it was, 2012. The Russians had proposed this in 2013. This was in the aftermath of the Chelyabinsk asteroid impact in Russia, and the deputy prime minister Rogozin, right? Yeah, Rogozin had proposed a joint proposal with the United States, and we held a conference here on that very subject as part of the Keisha Rogers congressional campaign. Yeah. So that's all included, the reporting, the interviews, the discussion of that conference is also. So this is on the table. The United States could take up the Russian proposal at any time for cooperation, as there are standing offers of cooperation from China. Yes, sir.
It's one of the kind of the things you should be aware of, right? And I'm all for protecting the planet. Okay, but there's reason to believe that the dangers of anything like that decrease on a continual basis. There's a Russian academician back in the 1940s and 50s, his name means only, the Russian Sviatsky, who had claimed that you've got at least three things which are signals of a catastrophe, a systemic catastrophe which occurred like about 10, 11, 12,000 years ago. Short period of comets, volcanoes, and earthquakes, he claimed were all signals of this ancient catastrophe, and that they've been damping exponentially since Roman times. These were everyday occurrences, the time of Julius Caesar even.
Well,
and then
the Russian, let me just add, the Russian scientists, and their materials are cited here, and they're interviewed in a number of cases as well, because they made, like Colonets and others, made presentations. They're part of strategic defense of Earth is we know that there are phenomena associated that are measurable phenomena associated with earthquakes, volcanoes, and other things, which become part of a broader development of a strategic defense of Earth program. And so that part of it, I would certainly say that's the direction we want to look at. But we should also not ignore what just hit in Chelyabinsk just 2 years ago in terms of this asteroid near impact or close-in impact. So science moves forward from the 1940s. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anybody's interested in knowing?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.